absolutely has implications for day-to-day lives of Americans.
The Pentagon has released the identities of the 3 troops killed. They are all from the same unit based out of Fort Moore, Georgia. The drone strike that killed them originated from an aircraft that approached their outpost at the same time an American drone was returning. Officials say that led to uncertainty over whether it was hostile and caused a delay to the U.S. response. More than 40 people were injured in the incident. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman denied involvement, saying that the militant groups act on their own initiative. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
The Qatari Prime Minister said there was good progress after weekend talks with the US, Israeli and Egyptian spy chiefs. They discussed possible ways forward on a new deal to release hostages of the Israel-Hamas war.
The Prime Minister of Qatar on Monday said that good progress was made toward a new hostage deal between U.S., Israeli, and Egyptian spy chiefs who met in Europe over the weekend.
I think yesterday was good progress made to get things back in shape and to at least to lay a foundation.
Speaking to an Atlantic Council webinar, Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani said he hoped to present a framework for such a deal to Hamas. Qatar and Egypt have opened channels to Israel and Hamas and brokered a 7-day truce in November, in which Hamas freed more than 100 of the 253 people it abducted in the October 7th cross-border rampage that triggered the Gaza war. In return, Israel approved increased aid and released scores of Palestinian prisoners. One of the former hostages is Amit Susana. On Monday, she visited the burnt houses on Kibbutz Kfar Aza, where she lived. Security camera footage shared with Reuters shows Hamas gunmen dragging her in a white sheet across a field toward Gaza. She stumbles, falls, and is lifted onto one of the captors' backs as she kicks and struggles.
It took them over an hour to take me to the border. I was beaten up really badly. My entire face and body was bruised and swollen.
Susanna spoke on Monday as part of a campaign by families and supporters of the remaining hostages to focus attention on their plight.
I hope that the remaining hostages there are able to keep their faith alive and stay strong. But even the toughest souls can't hold on for such a long time.
More than 100 Israelis are believed still captive in Gaza. Triggered the Gaza war. In return, Israel approved increased aid and released scores of Palestinian prisoners. One of the former hostages is Amit Susana. On Monday, she visited the burnt houses on Kibbutz Kfar Aza, where she lived. Security camera footage shared with Reuters shows Hamas gunmen dragging her in a white sheet across a field toward Gaza. She stumbles, falls, and is lifted onto one of the captors' backs as she kicks and struggles.
It took them over an hour to take me to the border. I was beaten up really badly. My entire face and body was bruised and swollen.
Susanna spoke on Monday as part of a campaign by families and supporters of the remaining hostages to focus attention on their plight.
I hope that the remaining hostages there are able to keep their faith alive and stay strong. But even the toughest souls can't hold on for such a long time.
More than 100 Israelis are believed still captive in Gaza. Israel has vowed to eliminate Hamas and return every hostage.
Still to come.
Were injured in a one-way drone attack, meaning they were attacked, they did not counterattack, and it impacted a base northeast Jordan. 8 injured service members were medically evacuated to receive higher-level care, according to CENTCOM, Central Command. It says the number of wounded is expected to rise as well. Biden vowed Sunday to hold those responsible for the attack to account, saying that while facts are still being gathered, and this is Biden saying it, quote, "We know it was carried out by a radical Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq." And again, the concern now is that we could get pulled into a regional terror war in Syria and in Iraq. And keep in mind that as Israel is, of course, defending itself against Hamas and launching attacks into Gaza, it's also expanding those attacks into some of the surrounding countries, including Lebanon. And as this happens, Iran is backing new terror movements, including mainly the Houthis, and they're shutting down some of the Red Sea ports and, of course, shipping channels. Meaning there's a regional terror war starting up that involves multiple countries now. Now, Biden responded to what could happen, saying in an event in South Carolina that, quote, "we shall respond." Watch this.
We had a tough day last night in the Middle East. We lost 3 brave souls in an attack on our base, and we shall respond.
Now, when Biden said, "we shall respond," that was
their main objective is to advance their own movement. Their movement includes goals to not only take over the remainder of Yemen, but to advance on both Mecca and ultimately Jerusalem. They see this as a global movement.
Rabi believes that no matter how many times the West strikes them, they will continue attacking shipping. If the West destroys all their missiles and drones, they would find other ways, such as remote-controlled bomb boats or unmanned underwater weapon systems. After starting in November, the attacks on container ships is ongoing.
For them to be shot at, as they were 3 different times on our fleet, one of which was an hour-long firefight that they were directly in the middle of, is just unacceptable. We've got to find a way to make the shooting stop.
Bud Dar is an executive at MSC Shipping Company. He says this series of attacks is unprecedented. The number one thing these container ships need is better communication devices.
Right now, we're using basically the radio or mobile phones if we're fortunate enough to have the connectivity. But having the communications with the combat vessels is vital.
David Heindel is the president of Seafarers International Union. He says there are 75 minutes between the time a missile is launched and the time it hits a ship. He said faster communications would help the ship avoid danger, a danger the U.S. may have helped cause.
In 2018, the U.S. Was part of a major effort to prevent the government of Yemen from retaking the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast. That is now a critical strategic failure on our part, because if the government of Yemen controlled that sea access, we would perhaps not be having the same conversation we're having today.
Back then, the U.S. didn't want Yemen's government to access the Hodeidah port for humanitarian reasons. Now, the Houthis control the port and are using it to launch their attacks. Virginia Gibson, NTD News.
Networks and launching attacks on individual terror groups or weapons emplacements, which is what we're currently doing actually already, versus going to full-scale war with the military of another country, which is what Iran would be. Now, that being said, Joe Biden is backing off of that narrative a little bit. Mirror.co.uk said that U.S. President Joe Biden has been given a chilling nuclear warning over attacking Iran after 3 U.S. soldiers were killed by a kamikaze drone. In my opinion, the word kamikaze is ridiculous here because it was a drone that just crashed and destroyed itself in the target. It says that ex-UN weapons inspector David Albright said the rogue state, Iran, could be led into thinking that building nuclear warheads is their best way out if they are directly targeted by the U.S. in retaliation for the deaths. I should note, Biden himself doesn't seem to be backing off of this too much. He's being warned, though, that if he were to launch direct attacks on Iran, that Iran would very likely respond by increasing their nuclear weapons development. I'd say there are a few holes in that narrative, one of the biggest ones being if we launch attacks on Iran, we'll probably strike their nuclear weapons development facilities, and at the very least, Israel has been saying that they want to do that. Iran is at about 60% uranium enrichment. And in a very short amount of time, they could field a nuclear weapon using what they've already developed. Also, of course, their ability to do this is not being deterred in any way. They've backed out of any agreement that they're going to not do it, although on paper they might still say, we're not developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, they're telling us directly, hey, it's essentially none of our business. And of course, as Iran comes closer to developing and even fielding nuclear weapons, this is bringing about some serious concerns, given that Iran is the largest terror sponsor in the entire world, although I'd say the CCP is probably a little higher on that list, working behind the scenes. Now look, if you remember what dragged us into the war in Iraq, you might remember, right? It was fake news from the New York Times. New York Times killed an untold amount of young men and women by claiming that Iraq had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Turned out it was fake. But the difference, of course, with Iran versus Iraq is that Iran is actually pretty close to being able to build nuclear weapons. In other words, if we went into war with Iraq over the concerns that they had weapons of mass destruction, Iran is openly doing it right now. In fact, they're very close to being able to achieve that. And of course, given this situation and given the rising threat of Iran in the region and around the world, and not to mention, of course, the Hezbollah networks, which exist as proxy forces all over the place, including in Latin America, probably right here in the United States, thanks to our open border policies, this would be a very large-scale war were it to happen. Now, given this situation, some of the more Bush-era type Republicans, and keep in mind the way the Republican Party has shifted, during the George Bush era, and I'd even argue into the Obama era, the Republicans were more like the pro-war party. George Bush openly said this many times, I'm a war president. And of course, there are some of those individuals still within the Republican Party who are very pro-war. And some of them are backing Biden and even encouraging him to start a full-scale war. Meaning that if Biden decides to do this, and I don't know if Democrats will get behind him on it, at the very least he could get enough Republican votes from Congress to be able to expand this. Meaning you would have Republican support probably on a war. Again, though, Democrats might ironically be the ones to block him on it. Now, New York Post says that a slew of Republican polls Sunday quickly called on President Biden to retaliate against Iran after 3 U.S. service members were killed and 34 others wounded in an attack by Iranian-backed militants in Jordan. And here's Senator Lindsey Graham saying, quote, "Hit Iran now, hit them hard." And of course, Lindsey Graham is known for his hawkish views, as it notes. And it notes as well, quote, this is according to Lindsey Graham, "When the Biden administration says don't, the Iranians do. The Biden administration's rhetoric is falling on deaf ears in Iran." And he said as well that Iran is undeterred. The only thing the Iranian regime understands is force. Until they pay a price with their infrastructure and their personnel, the attacks on U.S. troops will continue. Now, I'd say there's maybe a third option here. Of course, we're dealing with two options. Do nothing or do something, right? Either let them continue sponsoring terror networks and launching attacks on U.S. troops and sponsoring terror attacks against Israel, which, of course, all started after Biden freed up $10 billion in sanctions relief for them, you might remember. Or, you know what, maybe launch military attacks on them, destroy them, and probably drag us into a full-scale war with another country. Those are the two options we're being presented with. I'd say there's a third option, which is what Donald Trump did, which is cut off their money, sanction them, eliminate their funds, bankrupt them, and make it so they cannot afford to pay people to launch terror attacks. Even with Hamas, you might remember, Iran pays the families of suicide attackers. If people go and, sneak into Israel and stab children in their sleep, which happens, by the way, Iran will pay the families of that individual after they're killed. That money is coming from Iran. And of course, what happens if you shut down Iran's money? Well, suddenly, global terrorism mysteriously comes to a close. And what happens right after Biden gives them $10 billion in sanctions relief? Well, global terrorism mysteriously starts again. And here we are. There's a third option here, which is just renew the sanctions. That's just me, of course.
Foreign Secretary Lord David Cameron said the UK and its allies could consider recognising a Palestinian state at the United Nations to make the process irreversible. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly opposed the idea, saying it would endanger the state of Israel.
Yes, it would.
National debt stands at
The recent strike, notably against Houthi terrorists in Yemen. This is U.S. Central Command said this. As part of ongoing international efforts to respond to increased Houthi destabilizing and illegal activities in the region, on January 22nd at approximately 11:59 p.m., U.S. Central Command forces, alongside UK armed forces, and with the support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, conducted strikes on 8 Houthi targets in Iranian-backed Houthi terrorist-controlled areas of Yemen. They note that, quote, these strikes from this multilateral coalition targeted areas in Houthi-controlled Yemen used to attack international merchant vessels and U.S. Navy ships in the region. They say the targets included missile systems and launchers, air defense systems, radars, and deep-buried weapons storage facilities. Now, what's happening right now? We are very rapidly getting pulled into terror wars in Iraq, in Syria, possibly in Lebanon, and of course in Yemen, and maybe Iran, we'll have to see. But of course, a war with Iran would mean war with all these other countries as well. And of course, I think part of the bets on this are the good old military-industrial complex, which will heavily profit from such a battle. Because as they view it, I believe, this is just a very expensive war. And a very expensive war means a whole lot of business for those arms manufacturers. And a whole lot of business for those arms manufacturers means a long and drawn-out war, which will probably go on indefinitely, which is what the war on terrorism was until Trump oddly ended the whole thing very rapidly. Anybody see ISIS lately, or, you know, their whole Levant they tried forming? Whatever happened to ISIS and how they were conquering that entire region and built their own country? Whatever happened to that? Do you remember that? It seems like it ended very quickly as soon as somebody was actually interested in bringing an end to these networks, killing them just enough to let them continue. And of course, also allowing them to get funded, which is, of course, with the sanctions cut off, and the renewal of that money has allowed it to thrive yet again. Now, I'd say that all of this means we're apparently against striking military targets already in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and possibly more still to come. We're already doing this. This is, as Israel, again, has gotten its war with Gaza, the United States is already getting pulled into this terrorism war. We're already in it. It's just the reality. And Iran, notably, is also pushing the red line for a more direct war. And this is especially as Israel nears the red line on their end on possibly striking Iran on its nuclear programs. And, you know, Israel, they're not really listening to the United States anymore. Biden can tell them, hey, yeah, let's start peace deals. And Israel says, we're not listening to you, basically. Meaning they're unpredictable right now, and it's very possible they might go ahead and launch attacks on Iran. I should note that they've done this previously, even when the U.S., at least on the surface, advised them not to. And of course, there have been other methods of bringing down Iran's nuclear development facilities, including, for example, Stuxnet, which was a computer virus that destroyed their centrifuges. The origins of that still unknown, although I think we all know who did it. Now, look, of course, remember that Iran-backed global terrorism, again, is suddenly starting again after Joe Biden gave them $10 billion in cash in November. It was sanctions relief. And let me give you a reminder on that, because I mentioned it a few times, right? The argument for it was that it was technically already Iran's money. Biden didn't give them money. He just gave them a sanctions waiver that let them access $10 billion. He didn't give it to them. And also, you know, the other argument is that money is fungible. Here's an example. They could say, well, look, Iran can't legally use that $10 billion on terrorism. They can't do it, right? But the issue is, if you free up $10 billion for them to use on other stuff, like food and water or electricity or who knows what else, they can use the money they would have spent on that and fund terrorism. In other words, you pay for one thing so they don't have to pay it. And then the money they would have used for that, they can use that money for terrorism, which they're doing. Here's an example. Someone has $10 for food. You give them another $10 and say, hey, buddy, you can't buy drugs with this $10. And what happens? They can use the $10 that you gave them for food, right? Because you gave them $10 for food, and then the $10 they already have for food, they're going to go buy drugs with. And Iran, basically, as we can see, is already back to its business of sponsoring global terrorism, thanks to that $10 billion they now have to pay for the things that they were going to pay for anyways, and now they have all that extra money. Now, meanwhile, on the issue of global war, the United States is allegedly looking to station nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom. And this is, of course, being done with concerns that Russia is going to expand its war into other countries in Europe. But, of course, a nuclear weapon stationed in the UK would also act as a possible deterrent to Iran. This is a pretty serious development. I don't know how people in the UK feel about this, but let me show you. UK Independent says this. Ukraine could win the war more quickly if it had permission to fire British and other Western weapons against targets deep inside Russia, Ukraine's head of Navy has said. It says that the Vice Admiral told Sky News in the UK that the war would have been very different had Ukrainian forces been able to use Western munitions without restrictions from the very start. And they said, quote, "We must have the capabilities to make sure that Russia will give up forever the thought of even looking in Ukraine's direction, including at sea." And meaning, of course, that if they want to look at sea, we'll probably give them some kind of maritime attack or defense munitions, maybe warships even, who knows. It says that earlier it was reported that the U.S. was preparing to station nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time in more than a decade amid a growing threat from Russia. Under the proposals with the nuclear weapons, it says that warheads 3 times as strong as the bomb that devastated Hiroshima would be based at RAF Lincoln Health in Suffolk, according to Pentagon documents seen by the Daily Telegraph. It says these set out plans for a nuclear mission to take place imminently at the base. The MOD, Ministry of Defense in the UK, said it would not confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons at any location. Look, regardless, other countries are now preparing for the possibility of a new world war. Now, even outside of Russia, and Russia, of course, is threatening war directly against Poland. The UK is, of course, getting ready to possibly have nuclear weapons pointed at Russia, stationed on its own soil. Germany is preparing for possible war. Many countries in the European, Western European region, especially the Nordic countries, are preparing for possible war. And even outside of Russia, you also have the UK and the Old Alliance, Australia and so on, also already involved in the strikes against terrorist groups. In other words, if you count the proxy forces and the proxy wars as real wars, we're already at war in multiple regions. And look, other countries now are even floating the idea of mandatory conscriptions. Briefly on this, there are rumors right now, and I'd say credible ones because you've seen some pretty, what I would consider credible news outlets posting things about it, saying that as soon as tonight, and this was last night, that Biden was going to institute a military draft. We have not yet seen that. But there are very real discussions that we could see a military draft in the United States because we have a recruitment shortfall. And other countries now are also talking about a draft, military mandatory conscriptions. Here's Australia, just as one example of this, but this is happening in a lot of countries right now. News.com.au says Australia must seriously consider reintroducing conscription to boost its troop numbers in the face of a looming all-out war with Russia, a defense analyst says. And there are many reports like this. It says rapidly rising global tensions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East threaten to drag Australia into an orbit of an open confrontation. This is according to an associate professor of national security and strategic studies at Curtin University. And he added that it may be time for Australia to consider another uncomfortable subject, the return of national service. Meaning, you get drafted to serve your country and to die for your nation. And as this happens, of course, U.S. military aid to Ukraine is still caught in limbo. Republicans are using U.S. aid to Ukraine and to Israel, and they've even thrown Taiwan in there now, as a bargaining chip, saying they will not approve the funds until Joe Biden secures the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's just plain old refusing to do it. Not only is he refusing to do it, he's suing Texas and even threatening, conflict with Texas, possibly even a civil war, if Texas does not tear down border barriers and allow illegal mass migration into the U.S. The federal government is facilitating human trafficking. They are facilitating an invasion of the United States at a time when we're going to war, possibly, with terror networks that have very strong presence in these other countries. And look, on a note related to that money, like we've been saying, it turns out there was major corruption in Ukraine and how that money was being used. Lo and behold, remember I talked about this before? My stance on this from the beginning, and I've said it over and over again, I support Ukraine. I believe that Ukraine has a right to defend itself. I understand some technicalities over who done it, and of course the color revolutions that placed Zelensky in power. I'm also aware that Ukraine was regarded as the Wild West of government corruption for a long time. In fact, the money laundering oftentimes went through Ukraine. They are among the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth, especially for Western countries that, again, use it as their money laundering hub.